Okay, everyone. Hi, I'm not Rainer. As you can see, obviously I'm not. Rainer is in Oxford at the moment, so he's presenting his research there. And therefore I'm here today to hold the presentation for this week's lecture. I'm Nora Lindemann. I think some of you know me. There are some familiar faces, some people I don't think I know yet. And I'm also part of the Ethics and Critical Theories of AI research group. I'm a PhD candidate and a research assistant, so I work together with Rainer and with Paul, who also already did a presentation here. And today we will talk about responsibility and explainability. So two topics that are very dominating, very prominent in the whole ethics of AI debate. I'm pretty sure that you've encountered them on some points when you were thinking about AI and how to, do AI ethically. And for that, today I will first talk about the topic of responsibility, mainly in reference to Aristotle. And there I will talk about control and knowledge, which for Aristotle are two conditions to actually act and be responsible. Then I will talk about explainability, transparency, and accountability. So another three topics that transparency and accountability as two topics that also build up on that. And then we will look at some different understandings of responsibility, namely responsibility as answerability, responsibility as virtue, and responsibility as virtue. And in the end, I will give an outlook on so-called responsible research and innovation in AI, which is the idea of how can we, now that we've talked theoretically about how to be responsible, how to act responsible, also integrate that into AI and how to integrate that into design processes of designing AI systems. And the references for today's lecture are mainly these two. So the book by Virginia Dignam called Responsible Artificial Intelligence. Virginia Dignam is a professor for computer science at Umea University. And she is a very big figure in the debate on responsible AI, on how to do research on AI responsibly as well. And the other source is this paper by Mark Heckelberg, who is a professor of philosophy and media technology at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Vienna. He's also quite a big figure in the ethics of AI debate. And as you will see, I mainly refer to him in reference also to responsibility as answerability. So a bit later in this lecture. And with that, let us come to the question of what is responsibility. There broadly constitute two different ways in which responsibility can be understood. There are, of course, certainly also more, but these are like two dominant ones within the debate that we can probably identify. The first one is one's status of morally deserving praise or blame for an action or mission. That is, morally responsible is what makes you a moral agent, and with that someone committing an action in a way that is suspect to moral evaluation. The idea is, for example, I commit a crime, am I responsible for that crime or not? So this is the basic question then to ask. And this is a definition of responsibility that has been used often in Western philosophy and specifically in analytic philosophy. This is a common way how to understand responsibility. And what makes this perspective analytic and part of analytic philosophy is that it's often used to judge about a past action. So sorting out, like after an action, if you had the status of being responsible for certain consequence based on the action you did. The other way of understanding responsibility is more of a moral attitude or an ethos. I think you already encountered the idea of an ethos in this lecture, where The idea is that it's about striving to assess one's own abilities and the possible consequences of one's action in relation to moral obligations and aligning one's actions accordingly. So it's less descriptive and by itself and inherently more normative and having the ethicality within itself rather than ascribing it to someone after a certain action has been performed. So these are two ways, and I will come back to this at several points in the lecture, of understanding responsibility. And there's another way in which we can think about responsibility differently, namely two temporal perspectives on how we understand responsibility. One is ex post, so it's backward looking. Something went wrong, as I already gave an example, and the question is raised, who is morally responsible for what has happened? And it's about responsibility attribution. The other one is so-called ex ante, so it's forward-looking. A decision is to be made, and the question is how to proceed responsibly with respect to future effects. So it's a question of how do I decide whether I, for example, commit a crime, or how will I act in the future? And there's no strict link of these two temporal perspectives to the two ways of approaching ethics or responsibility that I just mentioned. However, there is a slight tendency to associate the first definition, so the backward-looking one, with also the first one that I mentioned in regards to moral responsibility. And in the second one, and you probably guessed that, he has responsibility more as an ethos, so more related to the second way of understanding responsibility, also as an ethos, as an attitude. They don't always need to go together in this way, but they often do. And with that, I will switch to Aristotle to learn a bit more about what responsibility can mean. Aristotle is, of course, a very influential philosopher who is still often referred to in the philosophical debate, especially in the Western analytic philosophical debate. And in his most popular work on ethics, the so-called Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle mainly discusses two different aspects of what it means to be responsible. Namely, control. So to be responsible, one needs to act voluntarily and have a control of the outcome in the sense of a co-causation of what is happening. So the idea is, if I don't act voluntarily, if I'm forced to do something, I can't be held responsible for my actions. And then the other one is knowledge. So the knowledge of what one is doing in the sense of an awareness, but also of the consequences, the potential implications. And with that, it's a question of if I don't know what I'm doing and what the consequences of my actions are, I'm not normally held responsible for that. So for example, when you have a 3-year-old, you probably don't say, oh, that child is responsible for all of her actions, because we don't think that she has a full knowledge of what she's doing and what potential consequences may be. And Aristotle formulates this as a way to also distinguish of when is one not responsible. So if one does not act freely, one cannot be responsible, and one cannot act freely if one acts under force or ignorance. And in the Aristotelian approach, and now relating this to ethics of AI, an AI system is always an instrument and never the moral agent. So responsibility lies within the human researching, designing, building, deploying, using, or regulating technology, and with that also AI technology. There is a huge philosophical debate, and in the end it's a metaphysical debate on whether AI systems can have consciousness or free will. However, in nearly all examples of today's existing contemporary AI systems, it's rather uncontroversial that they don't have consciousness and free will, as in they don't have intentional actions, as in actions that are self-willed by the agent and that they are being aware of. Going into this issue in whole detail would be a whole lecture for itself, so I will not delve into that, but take this as a kind of basic assumption on which I now build the rest of my lecture. And what is also important to note here is that saying that AI systems are always an instrument does not imply that we also see them as a tool. And I think you've already talked about this, like the tool conception of AI, where we have to say that they're merely tools and don't have any other further reaching consequences. Because these actions of these systems can, of course, be morally relevant, and they are always socio-technical, so they do not stand in isolation. So with that, let us look at these two different aspects of Aristotelian responsibility and ethics in a bit more detail. So about control and knowledge. First about control. And I will talk about them with these two temporal perspectives in mind. So the ex post and the ex ante perspective that I already mentioned. And from an ex post perspective, talking about control, the question is, who was it? Who did something? And who was in control? And these questions can actually be quite complicated in cases of AI, as you can imagine. Already in 2004, Matthias talked about the responsibility gap. Back then, AI was built slightly differently than it is today, so you could say, and some people argue that this is even more so the case right now, where the behavior of AI systems are not always completely predictable because they are statistical systems. And with that, he says that there are drastic consequences, that no traditional responsibility attribution is even possible in the case AI is involved. And another thing that's been mentioned in the debate here is the so-called problem of many hands that Taddeo and Floridi pointed out, where they say that the effects of decisions or actions based on AI are often the result of countless interactions among many actors, including, for example, designers, developers, users, then the software, the hardware, and with this kind of distributed agency of many people building these systems that then have a kind of implication, there also comes a distributed responsibility. And we propose to not call this distributed responsibility, because that sounds as if, well, I only have like this tiny fraction of responsibility and you have also a tiny fraction of responsibility. And that can also lead to kind of an avoidance of being and feeling responsible for what one does. And instead, maybe we should rather talk of a shared responsibility, where different actors also are responsible for what they're doing, and maybe also probably in different ways. But that does not mean that the responsibility in itself is getting smaller for individual agents. Let's look at this with two examples. And the first example is here on the left-hand side of the screen. You can see the Schalke benefit algorithm. So that was implemented in the Netherlands. And the idea was that you have an algorithm that could flag people who committed a fraud of getting Schalke benefits even though they weren't eligible. This algorithm ran for, I think, 7 or 8 years. And at some point it came out that the algorithm was hugely discriminatory. It mainly flagged families who were poor and people of color as people committing fraud, even though they actually didn't commit fraud. They were eligible to these childcare benefits. And the problem was that once the algorithm flagged them, the people, like the families, were then told that they had to pay back all the money, which had huge consequences for them, again, it were mainly poor families, and quite many then went into financial ruin. Some families then, kind of as a consequence of the stress this caused, were torn apart. Others were left with lasting mental health issues. There are quite many stories of this. So here we can also ask the question of who is responsible for that. Is it the government? Maybe. Is it the company who built the AI system, which is not the same as the company who did it? Is it people doing the auditing? Is it maybe also the more general public who didn't really think about this? Is it lawmakers who didn't forbid the use of AI systems for these purposes? So there are many different people who kind of share, in a way, the responsibility for what has happened here. The other example I want to give is of so-called social chatbots. So it's chatbots which are designed so that you have continuous interactions with them, have kind of social relations with them. There are many examples of them. One of them is Character AI. Some of you may have tried that out before, where you can kind of chat with an existing or fictional character. And one person who did that, rather a teenager, 14-year-old in the US, Cyril Setzer, did that for quite a while, got very close and emotionally attached to the chatbot he was interacting with, in a way that he retrieved from his family, his friends, his other social relations, and wanted, and more you could see, like in the chat logs, which were later released to the public, that he found this very close emotional tie and this idea of he wanted to be with this chatbot forever. And in the end, he committed suicide after the chatbot also recommended him to do so. And here, there's a lawsuit now pending. It's still not decided on what will be the legal outcome for this in the US. But again, we can ask who's responsible. Is it the company developing the chatbot? Probably they have some of the responsibility. But again, there are no laws against like implementing this technology. So we could also say maybe it's also politics. It's lawmakers, with that it's broader society. Some people also say like, well, maybe his parents should have been a bit more careful and like watch his media consume a bit more. We could also talk about educators and education. Maybe it's due time to like talk about these kind of systems, how they work, what they do, and also how they are designed to trigger certain effects in high schools. So we can see that there are quite many different ways of who could be held responsible. And then also what we can see here is that this ex ante perspective is not always the best one, because in both of these cases, the effects of algorithms, even if we ask who was responsible after they already did something like that was undesired, that was really bad, we may also want to ask that beforehand, right? Like, it's not great to have algorithms and people interacting with them and as a consequence in committing suicide, or families like, and that were like 26,000 families being flagged as fraud. So it's like a big scale of people being like impacted by this algorithm, which then really had an impact on their lives, on like whether they could, for example, keep their house or had to like sell it, whether they could get a mortgage, and so on. So with that, I think it becomes clear that it's also important to think about the ex ante perspective and also hear about this control component. And ask forward-looking questions like how to take control, who might be affected, who will benefit, who will be harmed when an algorithm is used at different levels and at smaller and broader scales. How to prevent side effects, things like function creep and structural effects. And all this then is primarily not a matter of someone else ascribing to responsibility, but rather its responsibility as a normative orientation. So a kind of ethos or attitude again, where the idea is to avoid a reduction to a limited scope of instrumental rationality, and with that to have in many hands constellations to seek involve stakeholders in a sense of a shared responsibility. So to not say, oh, like, but I didn't do this, but rather say, like, all stakeholders in the development and implementation process of a certain algorithm, of a certain AI system, should have this ethos of feeling responsible for the consequences. And with that, to proactively also address possible limitations, dangers, and side effects. Yes.
Before we continue, talking about this ethos of responsibility, and what would be an idea of how to manifest that, especially when looking at larger companies and stuff like that? So, because in a larger company, there's a lot of people that are just clock in, clock out, right? That I know a lot of people that say the shift ends, my work ends, and they don't put much more effort into this than what they see or what they need to do. And we know that a lot of people in coding are also, there's a lot of people in coding that don't really think about ethics very often and mainly just see these as mechanical problems. So how do we give this ethos of responsibility to?
Yeah, so two answers to that. One of them is, I will talk about this in a bit more detail later, at the end of the presentation. And the other one is, this is also a call. This is also a way of saying, like, in a normative ethical way, we should understand responsibility in the sense. So it is important to understand ethics more of an ethos than we currently do. Now we come to knowledge. Again, like in reference to Aristotle. And the knowledge component, mapping this to AI, to technology, Aristotle writes that a person may be ignorant then of who they are, what they are doing, what or whom they are acting on, and sometimes also what, for example, the instrument they are doing it with, and to what end, for example, for safety, and how they're doing it. For example, whether gently or violently. So what we can see is that Aristotle mainly talks about, when it comes to knowledge, talks about ignorance and conditions of not being ignorant. So when are you ignorant and you shouldn't be ignorant? And what we can see in this paragraph is that one, we need a reflexive knowledge about the moral agent. So the moral agent is the one acting morally, acting responsibly. We have a reflection about the moral meaning of the act, about the moral patience, which is the one where he says, like, whom they're acting on, so the person affected by certain actions or decisions and so on. And then about technology, about the instruments. All of these are necessary to not be ignorant. And again, let us have a look at this from this kind of idea of the two temporal perspectives. Ex post, this means that we do not interpret knowledge as a factual precondition of responsibility. Because, of course, in the ex post perspective, knowledge is something that actors can maybe easily deny. Also, again, in reference back to the responsibility gap into distributed agency. And the idea for Aristotle is rather to judge whether agents could have known. So you are also responsible to not be ignorant, to learn about and engage in what could be possible consequences of your actions and decisions. And this includes also, as I said, like the risk and contingent consequences. And from an ex ante perspective, this means that striving for knowledge is a moral obligation. It includes knowledge of the instruments and technologies, their side effects, structural effects, dual uses, function creep, and so forth. And it also means that we should not only try not to be ignorant ourselves, but also help others not to be ignorant, as in provide others with the knowledge they need in order to judge a technology, and specifically technology you are building. So instead of making algorithms more and more opaque, making specific functions more and more opaque, it is important to try to help people understand, okay, what am I actually engaging with? Like, a chatbot is not an agent. It does not have empathy. Like, it's programmed to imitate it, but it doesn't have it. These kind of things. And let us look at this also with another example. So here you have an eating disorder helpline chatbot, which was named Tessa, and it was implemented, or it was offered by the National Eating Disorder Association, or NEDA, in the US. They fired most of the human response workers, and then had a chatbot answering like questions people had about eating disorders. And it ended up offering healthy eating tips and advice on how to lose weight. The chatbot recommended, when asked users to have a calorie deficit of around 500 to 1,000 calories a day, which is a lot. It also recommended to like weekly weighings and measuring to keep track of weight. So these are all things which are really, really harmful when you have eating disorder. And again, we can see here that many people were involved. NEDA, this National Eating Disorder Association, did not build this chatbot itself, but had a company called Kaseya build it for them. Again, they also had like psychology researchers working there, like saying that they tested the algorithm. There's no supervision about these kind of systems that are implemented. So, for example, the FDA in the US, the Federal Drug Administration, is responsible for checking medical devices, but this isn't seen as a medical device, even though it is working in a kind of medical and mental health related, or like implemented in a mental health related area. So there is no oversight. And also, it seems that there's just little knowledge on all sides and people not putting the effort into knowing that, right? Like, the psychologist probably didn't really check for like, okay, if I input certain questions that are likely to trigger certain results because this machine learning algorithm, like, how could this be harmful? Whereas the people developing this chatbot may have not been like super aware of like what are actually eating disorders. Like, probably things like this really should be like not in there, like that it even has this idea of like weighing and measuring. So this is about knowledge, and again, also about responsibility. And as this also is again an example of where you can have the idea of a shared responsibility, which often leads to responsibility evasions, where people just say like, well, I didn't know. Maybe we need to think about responsibility more from a collectivist dimension, where not only individuals and companies are required to gain knowledge about their products, to act responsibly, but also users in society to a certain extent. And of course, like, there are differentials, and some people will be able to do this more than others. But where we need a more broader understanding of feeling responsible, because users in society should also be faced with the question of whether and how to use, research, and regulated technology. So if there's no pressure from the general public, politicians are not really concerned with this, with issues of AI, and only if they are concerned with that, some regulation will become implemented. With that, I will come to the second part of the presentation and talk about issues of explainability, transparency, and accountability. And with that, I stay within the knowledge dimension of responsibility, because all of these are, of course, about knowing about the system, knowing how the system works. And as you can perhaps imagine, in general, the knowledge component poses a challenge. Obtaining knowledge about possible consequences, side effects, function creep, structural and infrastructural effects of a new technology is often speculative, and especially in the case of machine learning systems, faces a challenge as these systems are adaptive, right? Like, We have reinforcement learning. When systems are implemented, there's a continuous flow of data that is used to change the systems. And with that, the actions or behaviors and decision-making mechanisms are not hard-coded in a traditional sense where you can say like, oh, like we have a decision tree and then we have like if-then conditions. But it is especially the system of adaptivity that makes it more difficult to talk about this in terms of modern-day AI systems. And with that, there have been more and more calls for explainability, transparency, and accountability. So I will go through them one for one. And first, guys, okay, what does accountability mean? Accountability means the capacity to explain and justify concrete decisions or actions by a system. This is only evident ex post, so something that is only possible to see after something has happened. It means that there should be a logging and reporting of how a decision and action was produced by an AI system. And we can think about this in a way of a principal-agent model, which originally stems from management theory, actually, but which may be quite interesting. So we have the principal here, which is the bigger figure, which is some human agent or human agents, and this is the responsible entity, the principal. And this principal then delegates certain tasks, certain decision-making, certain actions to an agent. And this agent then does not have the responsibility, but it should be accountable to the principal, as in it should be able to explain or report their own role in events or actions after they have happened. So it's a delegation of a task, right? From like the principal who delegates tasks to the agent, who then is accountable for the actions, whereas the principal is the one responsible. Let us talk about explainability, which is a related concept, but a slightly different one. So the idea of explainability is the capacity of one to responsible explain the actions and decisions to a moral patient. So moral patient, again, is the one who is affected by certain actions, decision-making processes, and so on. A common idea and call for is explainable AI, or XAI. I think you've probably heard about it. So the idea is to research approaches and sets of methods to explain the behavior of AI systems. And with this, XAI is merely an instrument to the responsible human agent. So the idea is, again, like the human can understand what the AI system is doing. And for that, this idea of explainability, of having this ex ante idea of what actually happened. Like, why did the algorithm decide that, I don't know, one family committed fraud when getting a childcare benefit and the other one didn't? The third concept here is transparency, which describes an openness about data, design processes, algorithms, actors, and stakeholders. In a sense that it is the capability to describe, inspect, and reproduce the mechanism through which AI systems make decisions, learn to adapt, are trained by data obtained from certain sources. Sources are often not quite clear. But with that, transparency has a lot to do with the ability to inspect and reproduce the whole system. So it's not about like a specific decision made or specific action output an algorithm recommends. But and with that, it's less about explaining in a deductive or derivative way, but it's more about making general mechanisms open and available for scrutiny. So for people to be able to understand how does the system as a whole work. And I have a figure to kind of try to show how these different principles or these different concepts also belong together. So when we have an AI model, this AI model is normally trained with training data. When we talk about machine learning, which we do, when we talk about modern AI, mostly. And then there's case input. So you have a specific case, which then produces a certain output. And this output affects a moral patient. So again, moral patient, the one being affected by actions and output. However, there's also the agent of responsibility, and this can be, again, like this would be a human or group of humans, group of stakeholders. Like that doesn't need to be an individual, even though it's the picture of an individual, just as the moral patient doesn't need to be an individual patient, but can also be a group of patients. And this agent of responsibility has responsibility for the moral patient the algorithm impacts. And with that, the agent of responsibility should be able to explain the reasons for why did something happen to the moral patient. And with that, it should also have an answerability. And I will come back to the question of what answerability means in this context later. And with that, we can see that to be able to do so, or also to make this easier for the agent of responsibility, the AI model should have this kind of accountability to the agent of responsibility, which is also aided by the idea of XAI. But then there's also more people involved. And this is, again, this collective dimension that I already pointed out, where we have society, which should have a kind of oversight and inspection over what is happening here. Like, where's my data going? Who's using it? In what way? What AI models are even used on me? Like, people didn't necessarily even know that it was an algorithm who flagged them as, like, committing fraud in the case of the childcare benefit algorithm. And to have this kind of oversight and inspection idea even, you need to have transparency. You need to know what the algorithm is, but also be able to understand how it's working. And we can see here that there are quite many relations popping up, right? Like there's not just like this is the one responsible and this is then the one acted upon, but we have quite many different stakeholders, and we also always have these relations in between different stakeholders. And one person writing about this and talking about this is Kuckelberg, who I pointed out as a primary source for today's lecture in the beginning. And he writes about responsibility as answerability and flags out a relational approach to responsibility, where he says, like, well, traditional ideas of responsibility in AI don't really hold for the following reasons. One, responsibility is not only about the moral agent. So in most debates, when starting off from Aristotelian concepts for responsibility, we look at the moral agent as a singular person, as a singular entity. But as has already been pointed out here, like there are many, many different potential stakeholders. And also, and this is the relevant part, we also need to talk about the moral patient in the responsibility relation. So not only about the one acting or not acting responsibly, but also the one being affected by that. And yeah, with that, Kuckelberg writes that responsibility is not only about doing something and knowing what you're doing, it is also about answerability. It is also a relational and communicative, perhaps even dialogical matter. The responsibility patient is the addressee, the one who's addressed in the responsibility relation. So what does this mean? Again, from these two temporal perspectives. It means, from the ex post perspective, that being able, that you need to be able and available to explain and give reasons to the moral patient. For example, of why one did a certain action, took a certain decision, recommended something, and so on. It also means that a moral subject must be available for praise and blame. So it is about having this dialogical exchange between the moral agent and the moral patient. If I'm not sure, like, okay, why was I flagged? Why did something happen to me? I need to have someone who talks with me about that, even. And this, Cockerberg writes, necessitates an embodied human-to-human exposure to questions, reactions, praise and blame by moral patients. With that, it cannot be automated. So I cannot just implement a chatbot which gives these kind of answers. Like machines, automated emails, and explainable AI models. But this answerability really needs to be in the human-human interaction, which is embodied and which also means that there can be a reflection. So there can be a reflection on part of the moral patient who is then kind of thinking like, oh, like, why did this happen to me? Now I can ask these questions, and then I can also figure out with the moral agent, why was this not good for me? Like, or why was this done? Why that was maybe what was the debate about this beforehand? And also in the moral agent, this can then trigger a self-reflection process. So if I'm asked by someone like, okay, but this was really like, why did you do that? Like, why did you decide to implement in this way and not in that way? That can also be a way of reflecting about one's own practices for a specific algorithm, but also beyond that. And thinking about this answerability component from an ex-ante perspective, so now like before something happens, this means that we should design AI systems in such a way that the responsible human can be answerable. So give reasons and explanations to the moral patients. To do so, like, we need to have something like explainable AI, where there is even the possibility to know that better and better. But it also means to be answerable to the future. So to include the perspective of stakeholders and potential moral patients in the decision about research, design, utilization, deployment, regulation. And so we can see here that this answerability is another layer that we can use to think about responsibility relations and also about especially pertaining the knowledge component of Aristotelian ideas of responsibility. Coming back to the topic of responsibility as a virtue, and I think you have already talked about ideas of virtue ethics in this lecture before at the previous point. So how does this relate then, this responsibility as a virtue, to AI systems? And one problem with that is the so-called Coleridge dilemma. And the Coleridge dilemma is a standard theorem in technology assessment. As you can see, it was already like introduced by a person called Coleridge, hence the name, in 1980. And on the x-axis here you have time. So you start at 0, a technology is thought about, and then at some point it's implemented, and you have a continuing timeline. And in the beginning of a technology, let's say of a machine learning algorithm, you have quite little knowledge of the effects, right? So this is the red line, where we don't really know yet, okay, what does it actually do? There's not a lot of testing. There's not, I don't know, that many chatbots and social chatbots used yet by like quite many people in society. So it's more like we don't really know. Like in the beginning, you also probably only have beta testing. You only have the idea of even to implement the technology. So we don't really know about the effects. And then as time progresses, there and more knowledge about the possible effects and about the actual effects of a system are collected. But then at the same time, the adaptability, so the changeability, the easiness of changing a system decreases sometimes. So that's the green line. So in the beginning, when you think about, I want to build this algorithm, there's a lot of adaptability still, right? So it's just like, oh, I have this general idea, then people come together, they have ideation processes. You maybe like just sketch something down, and then you build a first model, like normally a smaller one, just to test it out. You have beta testing and so on. But then throughout time, more and more resources are put into this algorithm. So it's not as easy to change it anymore because there's already like a financial loss if you just stop using it, for example. And also, like, you have all this data, you have the training runs. You already heard also, like, there are also environmental consequences of these, like, huge training runs for, like, for example, large language models. So the adaptability with that changes, like the easiness of changing a system decreases, whereas the effects of the knowledge of the effects that a system has increases throughout time. And Hollingridge says that when change is easy, the need for it cannot be foreseen. But when the need for change is apparent, change has become expensive, difficult, and time-consuming. So I think this is a good summary of what I just said. And with that kind of ideas of, oh, I now have an idea of like, this is how AI systems in general should be built. I formulate certain principles, and then in this way, all future AI systems should be built. That doesn't really work. That quite often fails because the consequence and effects of AI are not reliable, foreseeable. Because of the Hollingridge dilemma, but also because of the structural effects and of repetition and scale of algorithms. And this is also something that we've already talked about, because of the adaptability and partial ubiquity of machine learning systems. And hence, and this is where we come back to the idea of virtue ethics and ethics more as an attitude, we need to ensure ethical and responsible AI by informing the attitude and ethos of all agents involved. So this is kind of a proposal going along with what you've already heard in the lecture of thinking about AI ethics and about responsibility in this case, more in terms of a virtue and an ethos of the person acting. And this means now to, one, take joint control, so to consider always the contingent and structural effects. I think you've already had many examples of how algorithms can be discriminatory. You also heard about the environmental impacts and so on. We also need to seek and share knowledge. This pertains to the knowledge condition and the idea of not being ignorant in Aristotle's terms. So to enable collective awareness, make systems transparent as possible. Talk about this, like talk about how algorithms work. Not everybody needs to be able to build the most sophisticated model, but we can all try to understand how machine learning works. Like it's not rocket science in a way, can be. But it's like, it is understandable on a basic level of how these systems work, right? And with that also to involve all stakeholders. Not only the people who make money with it maybe should be involved, but also the people who are very much affected by it. The people who are then in the end, suspected to commit a fraud when it comes to childcare benefit. Maybe you should also ask them as the ones who will be subjected to the algorithm involuntarily. And this then posed the question, or means that exercising the virtue of responsibility requires practical and methodological skills. And I will come with that to the last part of this presentation, where I will address the question in some way of how can we think about this in practice. And this is not a one-by-one guideline and more of a still broader idea of how to do that, but an idea and approach that has been termed responsible research and innovation in AI, or RII, which is quite common. And RII is an interactive process by which societal actors and innovators become mutually responsive to each other with a view to the ethical acceptability and sustainability and societal desirability of the innovation process and its marketable product. So the idea is to have a distributed way of building technology, of thinking about research and innovation. And Virginia Dignam, the one whose book I also mentioned in the beginning, writes quite extensively about RII and proposes to have the so-called ART or ART principle of research, responsible research and innovation in AI. Namely, she says that we need accountability, responsibility, and transparency. So all of these issues and aspects that we've already talked about. And in this understanding, AI are socio-technical systems. You have heard about this in relation to human-aided AI, that concept that Rainer introduced. And with that, it necessarily includes all stakeholders. So Dignam writes that one, we need accountability, the I, and accountability is the requirement of a system to be able to explain and justify its decisions. We've talked about this. You can remember like the big figure and the smaller figure. And what this means is that there's always a relationship of delegation, or nearly always, because again, not one system is solely responsible, and also there is more than one person involved in building an algorithm. And these relationships of delegation pertain to operators who delegate something to an AI technology, employers who delegate something to employees, but also society, for example, who delegates something to politicians. The second thing that we should have in RI is responsibility. So for Dignam, as for Aristotle and Köckelberg, responsibility always lies within people. And this is then a moral relationship. So, and a moral relationship among multiple actors as a shared responsibility, including the entrepreneurs, the designers, the developers, the users, the regulators, but also maybe groups like future generations who should be thought about when we think about should we build these systems, when we take the environmental impacts into account, like what kind of consequences will it have if we automate something like grading or like, I don't know, teaching and delegate all this to an algorithm, like what kind of impacts will this have? This is also a question of responsibility within a moral relationship. And then the last part that Dignam points out is the transparency. So to repeat, transparency is the capability to describe, inspect, and reproduce the mechanisms through which AI systems make decisions and learn to adapt to their environment. Also, this includes the topic of data. And about being explicit about the choices made. So there should be documentation of why were certain decisions made, why was the model built and designed in a certain way, and so on. And this allows for and is in itself a relationship of oversight. So it's an openness of processes to enable a public debate. If we don't know that an algorithm is used in a certain way, we can't even talk about it, right? Like there's just no way to know it otherwise. But it should also enable deliberation and audit and public scrutiny. And what Dignum says then is that we need design for values in AI, which is a methodological approach to incorporate moral values into design, research, development, deployment, and management of new technologies. This involves to identify the relevant stakeholders. It also means to elicit values and requirements of all those stakeholders who are relevant and involved. It means to provide means to aggregate the value and value interpretations from all those stakeholders, and to maintain explicit formal links between values, norms, and system functionalities. And I will talk about this in a second. And lastly, it also means a justification of implementation decisions in terms of the underlying values. And to start this, or to talk about this in a bit more detail, I think you saw this before, a very similar slide on what are values and what are norms. Values in general are more general guidelines. So what do we conceive of as right and wrong, about good and bad? What is a good life? What is a desirable life? And so on. And values that societies have, for example, are freedom, but it can also be safety, honesty, benevolence. And the key, these values then are key drivers in human decision making. They motivate human action and they make alternative actions comparable. So, I don't know, we quite often have the value of not lying. So when I interact with a person, because I have this value of it's probably not good if I lie, I won't lie to them, but tell the truth. And it's quite important that these values are always contingent. They are societally contingent, they are culturally contingent, they are dependent quite often on context, and they are also historically changing. So they don't always need to be the same. They are not every like the same on everywhere in the world, and they are not same every time in history. And these values then translate into norms, and just like values, they are also contingent. And these are more concrete and actionable rules that we follow. For example, do not force anyone, respect others' interests, do not kill, do not lie, help people in need. And they provide a bit more actionable ideas of how you should behave. And even though we have them, and I think when we read them, most of them are like, yeah, that makes sense. Like we agree on these kind of values and norms. They are often implicit. However, they are societally enforced. And you will be judged if you don't adhere to these norms, at least in certain situations. What Dignum here says is that to design for values in AI, we first need to identify values, to aggregate them and to choose collectively between stakeholders which values are most important, probably. And these values need to be interpreted from within a concrete societal context. And these interpretations lead to certain norms. And these norms, and this is where she applies them to AI systems, should then be concretized into certain functionalities of a system. So this is the one way, but this also goes to the other way. It goes the other way around. So like system functions need to be also understood in terms of their norms, their normative effects, and the consequences in their socio-technical context, which in turn need to be aligned and also realigned with values of potentially different groups of stakeholders. So there's this both way kind of new relation between values, norms, and functionalities, which in a way get more and more concrete or more and more broad. To give an example of this, we have the value of fairness. And talking about stakeholders, I think most of you have probably seen an image like this, where it is a difference when we talk about fairness, whether we mean equality or equity. So the idea of equality is everybody gets some help with a certain task or a certain goal they're pursuing. For example, watching a sports game, and then some people can look over a fence, others cannot. And one idea is everybody gets the same box. Equity is more the idea of, people who are smaller probably need a bigger box to look over the fence, so to say. But maybe there are also other stakeholders involved. So when we talk about equity, maybe as an able-bodied person, they may not even be aware that for some people, climbing a box is actually not possible. So a more intersectional idea of equality, which pertains then to the value of fairness. So what we can see here is that it is important to involve different perspectives and different stakeholders, because as a person, I'm always situated in a certain context, and I may not even have any awareness of how other people experience the world and face different obstacles. With that idea, we can think about how to design values in AI. And this is a bit more of a complicated graphic. I will walk you through it, but I can also really recommend you reading the Dignum book, or specifically the chapters 4 and 6, where I take these ideas from. And Dignum writes in a very accessible way, so it is a quite nice read. And on the left-hand side here, you can see the design for values approach that Dignum proposes, where you have values, norms, and functionalities. We talked about that. And on the right-hand side, you can see the more software engineering approach, so the domain requirements. And these domain requirements shape the design of software systems in terms of the non-functional, the functional, and the operational and physical. And Dignum points out that we always need to incorporate both. So instead of just thinking about what is possible, what can be done, we should also think about what should be done. What is good? What is something built on certain values that can be agreed upon, that different stakeholders also identify as important values and norms, and how they think that can be translated into functionalities. And both then the domain requirements and the ethical concerns should be brought together and aligned in AI system design. So there you have on the top level that values and non-functional requirements should inform specification of the motives and role of the system, and making clear what is the intention of the system and its scope. So even be very clear about it to the public, like what is actually the idea and what's the goal, and why is a system built in a certain way. And norms here provide the ethical and societal boundary for the goals of the system, which at the same time need to guarantee that functional requirements are met. So just having certain values does not mean that it's possible to build a system in this way. On the second level, you can see that norms, or the ideas in this approach, that norms provide the ethical and can provide the ethical societal boundaries for the goals of the systems, which are at the same time needed to guarantee that the functional requirements are met. So again, you can see that the goals here both need to align with societal norms, but also need to be built or to be formulated in a way that is functional. And the third layer then here, the third line, means that the implementation of plans and action follows a concrete language and platform instantiation of the functionalities that have been identified by the design for values approach, so by the left column, while also ensuring operational and physical domain requirements. And with that, we can see that the idea of this approach of responsible research and innovation is to have these complicated way of thinking about systems, but in a way just really paying attention to, okay, what does it do? And this involves to ask stakeholders, ask all different types of stakeholders about values, norms, and functionalities, but on the other hand, also integrate the perspectives, of course, of the people who are building those systems. And what Dignam also stresses is that it's important to make explicit the link between values, norms, and functions of the economic decisions that are made, of the structural, architectural decisions on the side of product and software development, and to keep these kind of links monitored on the one hand, so there should always be someone who knows about this, and also documented, because only then can we have something like transparency and also responsibility. And with that, Dignam writes that responsible research and innovation in AI requires a dynamic alignment of design for values and software engineering processes. And this is only possible if, well, we strive for this, and also if the people and stakeholders involved have this approach of being responsible and feeling responsible to a certain way. And with that, to have this kind of ethos of responsibility for the consequences the technology they build may have. Thank you. There's still some time for questions. Yes.
So what time is reasoning kind of the morally responsible means that you have some control of the outcome of what you're doing.
Can you speak a little louder outside?
So being morally responsible is supposed to mean that you have control about the future, basically what the future outcome is. I kind of think that is ultimately not true, right? Because we can't really know it. And then the question I have in regards to AI, we don't know how AI develops, and quickly, as we have found out in the lecture already, there are strong concerns raised to AI, so it isn't just applying this knowledge consequently and really to say AI shouldn't be developed.
Like to your first question, I think that is especially like we cannot know about the future, and this is especially true with AI systems, right? Like, so this ethics or ethos of responsibility is not to say someone needs to know about all possible consequences, because that's impossible, and I absolutely agree with you. The future is unknown, and it's good that it's unknown in a way. But that doesn't mean that we can't think about what are probable consequences of doing this. So when people decide on let's automate mental health care, as in the example of the chatbot pertaining to, or like implemented for the NIDA, the National Eating Disorder Association, like it is still important to think about like what could possibly go wrong if people ask questions about like losing weight, and especially, so it's like it's not about knowing all possible consequences, but it's about being aware of possible consequences and trying to involve different stakeholders who give ideas on like what could be possible consequences or likely consequences. So trying to align these with the values that we have, such as fairness, such as non-harm, and so on. And of course, that's not going to be perfect. I'm not saying that we can solve all problems of AI in this way. We won't. But it's a way of trying to mitigate harms and to trying to make harms less likely. That we have the first part. And I think the second part of like, should we then not build any systems at all? I mean, this isn't saying that there are no good ways of AI systems, right? And the problem, again, or like one thing is that we talk about AI, I mean, there are so many different applications, right? You have something like ChatGPT, you have something that identifies whether you have like skin cancer. Like those will be different different algorithms and very different contexts and very different values and norms and stakeholders involved in like decision-making processes. So I think it's always difficult to make these kind of very broad statements about AI in general, as a technology that has just so many different aspects and so many applications in different domains. Mm-hmm.
Wait, but okay, so going off that question and going off with the example that you gave and the example in the lecture, of the chatbot that was given the responsibility of answering to people with eating disorders, would not the ethical moral stance or the ethical moral right decision would have been not to make the chatbot? Because exactly, we cannot know the future. We do not know what this chatbot's going to do. We do, though, however, understand that we can express morals and ethics between people a lot easier. It's a lot easier to understand who we hire, what they're going to say, what they're going to exist with human beings, because we can talk to them. And then lastly, is it not ethically just to give the person who's going through the eating disorder a human being to talk to feel their pain? So I just going off the point of like, should we just not invest, like, are there certain bounds of AI? Shouldn't we within this ethical context say, yes, there are certain spheres that AI shouldn't touch?
I mean, I would say so. Not everybody would agree, but like, yes, I would say so. And I think having like a chatbot like this just isn't a good idea. Because there's no empathy. And the people who worked there previously actually were mostly people who had gone through eating disorders themselves. So they had also this embodied perspective of like, okay, I know how it feels, and I'm also just here to listen and, to tell you that you're not weird and that it is actually a disorder and that it is a serious problem you're having. And a chatbot just can't do that. It can imitate that, but it can never actually have this feeling. Any more questions? Yes.
Maybe just one more small thing. Previously, it's not clear how AI could be in the future sustainable. So shouldn't we then at least say, okay, no further building of AI until there is an outlet, just like you explained, where it's documented how it would be sustainable. Then with the green light, and only then development continues, but not like right now, it should have on-site control like that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a matter of debate, but I don't want to tell you like this is how we should do it. I mean, Paul would probably agree. And I would also lean towards we should be very careful. I think it does make it makes a difference on whether we're talking about these huge scale models or whether we talk about like rather small models for a very specific context. I do think that there it's easier to think about consequences and also the environmental harm is less big. But yes, we should really start weighing the consequences of what these models mean with the benefits that they have or not have. And also think about like, okay, who's profiting from them? Like, is it the people using them, or is it the companies making money with them? And who profits more? And what is what we want, especially when we think about the environmental costs? If there are no further questions, we're done for today. I hope you took something away from this. And I think you have discussion groups as well, right? So there will be room to discuss this, I think, in more groups, because this is something that we should discuss. And it's important to have these discussions, and I don't want to always just tell you what you should think, but you should think yourself as an informed ethic. Okay.